Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we are kicking off Scorsese September as we head into the fall and in anticipation of Scorsese's big feature film coming out in October, Killers of the Flower Moon. And we are going to just be revisiting some of his great works in the month of September. So today we are starting off with King of Comedy. Sarah, do you want to kick us off with an IMDb summary for King of Comedy?
Sure. Robert Pupkin is a passionate yet unsuccessful comic who craves nothing more than to be in the spotlight, and to achieve this, he stalks and kidnaps his idol to take the spotlight for himself.
All right. And in our usual traditions, let's start off with our one-sentence summaries for King of Comedy. Sarah, what was yours?
Mine is, some people will do anything for a laugh.
Nice. Indeed, anything. My one-sentence summary is, some good-natured kidnapping is surely the not-so-fine line between dreams and delusions.
Nice.
Maybe that's where we draw the line.
That seems as good a place as any.
Yeah. I know it can be a slippery slope between dreams and delusions, but once we've reached a certain part of the slope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's just say no to kidnapping. That feels like a good stance to take.
Okay, let's start off with our initial thoughts of King of Comedy. Now, this did come out in the 80s, so if you haven't seen it yet, we will not spoil the movie in this first section, and then we'll include a spoiler and then have full reign over all of the content that happens in this film. Okay, so Sarah, I am intrigued to hear your thoughts about King of Comedy.
Yeah, I had a great time with this movie.
Yes,
It's
fabulous.
I was surprised reading afterwards that this was a box office flop, and at the time it was considered like this giant like failure of a movie. And that really surprised me because there's so much that's so good in here. Like Robert De Niro gives a fantastic performance, and to bring uh, Rupert to life in the way that he does
Yeah.
is exceptional. And the way that that character is written too, like it would be so easy to outright villainize him, but there's something sympathetic and empathetic about him, even though he is mentally unwell and he is doing very, very bad things. There's still, I don't know, there's still some sympathy for him. uh it's just good performances all around, good writing. I think it's a very thoughtful film. Like, I am so surprised that this was not better received at the time. And I feel like, I mean, Scorsese has a million movies that are all phenomenal and like well known and well regarded. So it makes sense that this might not be top of mind when it's in contention with all of his other films. But I think that this movie is fantastic. And it's I would say like one of his best movies.
Mm-hmm.
Uh so it's so interesting to me that this wasn't well received and kind of flies under the radar.
Yeah, I've thought about that quite a bit, especially watching this a second time, which is that I think that likely this film, my hypothesis, is pretty misunderstood. It is such a blend between this incredible cynicism, but also it's not Taxi Driver. I've thought about the connection and relationship between Rupert and Travis Bickle and some of the themes of King of Comedy and Taxi Driver quite a bit the second time around. And I think that there's this sheen of, lightheartedness and kind of a little bit over the top characters that it's not really a comedy. It's not that it's there's funny moments, but this is not funny at all. There's something deeply unsettling about this. But it's not so far into that realm where it is a gritty, um, jaded view of society and of human nature. So I wonder if this film is so complex that perhaps like upon first viewing this is a confusing experience. Especially I think about this coming out in the 80s too, and that coloring the way that audiences receive this. I actually feel like there's so many things in this film that are so relevant for where we are right now that I'm once again floored and surprised that this came out in 1982. You know, that was mind-boggling to keep in mind as I watch this movie again.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I guess one of those moments where you see the consistency of human nature, and how things that were present back then are still present today, and it just
Mhm.
maybe looks a little bit different, but those underlying truths about humanity and our society are still relevant. Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, yeah. It is crazy. And I love that you nodded to De Niro's performance. I think this is one of the more challenging types of roles to play because it toes the line between so many of these different aspects of his character, and it's so easy to tip too far into this like sympathetic character or too far into this highly dangerous, like unhinged character, and he somehow is able to hold both of those things at the same time with his portrayal of Rupert. And um, our relationship to Rupert, I think, slowly changes and evolves as the film progresses as well. And we see more of that like frenetic energy in him, and the delusions really show themselves more. But there's something incredibly endearing about like the inherent tenacity and persistence of a character like Rupert that in another version of this film we would be rooting for, you know, and that that spirit of going after what you want and chasing your dreams and making it happen for yourself. Like there's something about that that inherently um, feels exciting and sympathetic for us as something that we can root for as an audience. And so, man, De Niro does such an incredible job with this chaotic energy of Rupert while also making him so human and also so unsettling at the same time. And that is a combination of many things that is hard to keep in balance together in this like very very nuanced tension that he does. So I'm like more impressed watching this again is how well he's able to execute that.
Yeah, yeah, this is a very complex character, and it's interesting to kind of watch how our response to Rupert changes, like you said. Like at first, it almost seems like this, you know, pull yourself up from your bootstraps kind of thing. Like, oh, okay, is he actually like this really talented comedian and he just hasn't had his shot and we're going to see him, like work his way up and achieve this thing that he's wanted. And then as the movie goes on, it's like, oh no, this is something else entirely. And it's even funny how the film really doesn't distinguish between his reality and his fantasies, and I loved that part of it. How there are certain times you'll be in a scene and it's like, "Oh, okay, we're just going along," and then you go, "Oh, no, wait, I don't think that this is real." And I love the way that the film is constantly playing with that and how that affects how you see Rupert and the story as a whole. So I think there's so many just really smart things that this film does to kind of keep you on your toes and keep you engaged in what's going on, as opposed to this becoming kind of stale and just I mean, when it all comes down to it, it's just a dude who didn't get what he wanted and he isn't able to handle that. But the film does so many interesting things to make that
Mm.
such a fascinating story for us to live in for a while.
Yeah, yeah. But this seems like a good place for us to include a spoiler alert. So if you haven't seen King of Comedy, we recommend checking it out so that you come back and listen and you have that full context. This is a gem of Scorsese, so we really recommend watching before continuing to listen. Okay, let's dive into some of those some of those things that this film does. I think that the middle section of this film is the most interesting to me because it is the journey that we go on from where we start and our relationship to Rupert in that opening scene where he tries very hard to get his opportunity, his shot with Jerry in the taxi cab, all the way through to the ending where, uh, like you mentioned, it is unclear. This is probably his sense of fantasy that he's playing out in his mind. Uh, Before we actually get to the middle section, I'm curious how you read the ending because I think that'll maybe influence how we talk about the middle section. What was your interpretation of what happens in kind of those ending two scenes? The first where he's on stage, the second where he's being announced like again and again and again in a red suit. That scene.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that is super fascinating because I think that you can read the ending two different ways, and I think both are plausible. Um, I read it as a fantasy. Uh, I didn't read it as him actually like becoming famous, but that is not out of the realm of possibility just because like again of who we are as a society and what we value and people coming to fame or I guess infamy may be a better word. So it really could be either one, but I definitely read that ending as a fantasy and not reality. How about you?
I read it as a fantasy as well. I think particularly because one, the announcer's repeating again and again, and it is like, he's just in his fantasy relishing in that moment of applause and praise. And we've seen him do that in front of this wall plastered over with a poster of the adoring fans in his mother's basement. So it is, he's letting that like wash over him repeatedly in his fantasy. But two, like, I think visually it feels like it has this sheen. The colors are far more saturated than any other part of the film. The use of color in general is far brighter. Like, he is, granted, he's on stage, but there is like a brightness about that feels like it is no longer grounded in reality. But I think what's also interesting about that scene is that you could interpret it as reframing the rest of the film entirely as being one large fantasy. Like, none of this happened. It is all what he envisioned or imagined that maybe he could do to get his moment of fame. So, I initially read it as just that moment was him in his fantasy, but you could also use that as a framing device for the rest of the film as well.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things that makes this film so fun is y- two people can watch the same movie and walk away with a completely different read and a completely different takeaway from this. And I think both are there and present. And so I think, sometimes with ambiguous endings or endings that can be interpreted in multiple ways, it can be, I don't know, frustrating, but I don't feel that with this. I think it shows the depth of the writing and the depth of this film that you can read it multiple ways and they're all valid and they're all there. And I think that makes this movie even more impressive.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's so true. And I think that depending on which of those two interpretations you have, it um, potentially casts a light on what we believe society is capable of, like you mentioned. Like, if this reading is he really has his, long awaited autobiography that has come out and he is getting that attention through infamy, just like a pretty cynical view on the things that like we give our attention to. But this is why I think this is so relevant for our current times, which is like we as society are starting to think about what stories and who we give our airtime to and our um, time and attention, especially like media and news sources and all that kind of stuff are beginning to think about how do we talk about people that have done bad things in the news and not fuel this feeling of and the desire for recognition and to be remembered that often fuels a lot of the things that some of these awful things that happen are stemming from, like just this desire to be seen and known and remembered, even in a twisted way. You know, we see that so much with Rupert, and I think one things that he says at the end there on stage, which I just thought was packs such a gut punch, is when he says, "Tomorrow you'll know I wasn't kidding, and you'll all think I'm crazy. But I figure it this way: better to be king for a night than a schmuck for a lifetime." And I was like, that in and of itself requires so much unpacking. There's so much packed into that statement.
Yeah, yeah, and that is the thesis of this, entire movie. Like, I feel like that is the one sentence summary of this movie,
Yes.
is that line. And we just see Rupert living that out. And I find that so interesting that he would go to these incredible lengths just to get that high that he's always wanted, rather than actually like putting in the work and doing it the right way. I think that's something that kind of surprised me about this film, is how gracious and understanding the people in the office were. Like that woman Kathy, oh my gosh, she went above and beyond for this man. And I was like, he's lucky that he even got as far as he did with her. Um, but he didn't see that as kindness. He didn't see that as gracious as she was being, and instead
Mm.
took this other route. Um, so I even think that that's interesting. It's almost this like weird shortcut that he goes on to be a king for a night, and then he obviously knows that he's going to suffer the consequences for it. But I don't know, just seeing the value systems and his thought process in that is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you bring up, which is that it is such a window into his decision making and the way that he weighs these two options. You know, like it is not the choice between um, putting in the hard work and taking the long game and doing it right. It is the the alternative for him is being a schmuck for a lifetime. And the fact that he ascribes that value judgment on a life pursuing something that maybe doesn't come to fruition as to him like an absolute failure, um I think makes the attractiveness of the alternative, which he takes and carries out in the course of the film, feel a lot more feasible for him. You know, like there are only two alternatives to him, and it is worth it enough to avoid being a nobody for his entire life. It is worth it to him to protect himself against that, to go this very other extreme route. So I think it's like such a window into the ways that his decision making and value judgments become more and more extreme. Like he is only seeing two extremes, therefore it makes it easier to choose one of the extremes versus for most of us, um, we we don't see it in those two polarizing options, right? And so like that in and of itself is pretty fascinating, and I think the film basically is this PSA around like those that feel like they don't have a lot to lose or that the alternative is so unbearable are able to be pushed to these extreme scenarios where they at least have some sort of agency. This is where I started thinking a lot about the relationship between Taxi Driver in this film and Travis Bickle and Rupert, which is both men feel so helpless and isolated, and they have a desire for something that they would rather at least do something about and take things into their own hands than to sit and wait and continue to feel like they have no agency. And that person, when they are deluded into these views of society and the things that they want, like, are terrifying to imagine, because they now have both the initiative and the agency to take the action and also the extreme views that are aligned with it. And that's a terrifying combination for us, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and I think to your point earlier, we see that in our world all the time today. You know, you can get something
Mhm.
as simple as people wanting to go viral on social media and wanting to be influencers and not understanding that that actually requires work, to people doing violent acts when they don't get their way or when they think they're entitled to something and they don't get it. And so I think again, this character is still so relevant today, and we're seeing that being played out in micro and the macro scale. Uh, because I think in so many ways we don't value as a society that kind of slow, methodical work as much as we may be used to. And it's this desire to be an overnight sensation, the whole like microwave generation thing.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
I feel
Mhm.
like that's kind of the ethos of Rupert as well. And it's just wild to think how much that is in our world today. Uh, I mean, even in us. I mean, it's so easy to want to accomplish something and we want this goal and not always wanting to put in the work required to achieve that goal. We see somebody else doing it and it's like, "Oh no, I want that. I can do that," without seeing the years or decades of work that they put into it. I don't know, it's just interesting to think about.
Mhm. No, I think it's a really good point, and there's so many, like, visual themes in this film around that portrayal of adoration and praise and the spotlight, like, right after he says that line around "better to be king for a night than a schmuck for a lifetime," it cuts immediately to a shot of him on, like, multiple TVs in a store window, and in a way, he has achieved that, like, he has achieved a momentary spot in the limelight, and that is worth it to him for all of the other consequences that come from it. And he even gets his little autobiography that he gets to write around it. Like, it worked for him, and so this film feels like such a warning in some ways around, like, the things that we give attention to and what that does for encouraging certain desires and behaviors, and how we showcase, like, the path to, like you mentioned, the path to um honing a craft enough to be deserving of that limelight and that spotlight. And then you see, in his basement, I love this shot so much. It's such a hilarious detail, but also, like, so tragic for this character. But, like, that giant wall in his mother's basement of just the adoring fans that he's standing in front of, like, practicing his bit. I think it's so clearly fake and thin. It's, like, black and white, and visually that is ingrained in my brain, and I think it is also so visually indicative of the thing that Rupert desires most. So, Scorsese does an incredible job of, like, bringing that character trait in him and that desire in him and showing that to us in a very, very visual way.
And one thing that I loved about that shot is it's one of those moments where I feel like the film is playing with the audience a little bit, and because you don't see Travis, or not Travis, that's a different movie. You don't see Rupert perform.
Freudian slip.
I know, right? These would be fascinating to, like, really analyze together.
Mhm. Yeah.
Uh, we can do that another day. But, uh, you don't see Rupert perform until the end, and there's all of
Mm.
these little moments where you'll see him, like, start his bit, and then it stops. In that moment in his basement, he starts doing it, and all you hear is the laugh track just getting louder and louder and louder. And I love that this whole movie, I was wondering, number 1, am I ever going to actually hear his bit? Am I gonna hear his stand-up? But number 2, I was also wondering if he was any good. And so it started out at first, I was like, "Oh, okay. He's probably not very good. That's why he hasn't been able to break into the business." And then I started to wonder, like, "Oh, wait, could he actually be good?" And then the more that he refused to actually go to any stand-up place and actually, like, try it in front of an audience, I was like, "Oh, no, he can't be good." So I went on this whole journey wondering about the competency of this character,
Wow,
in
that's so
addition
fascinating.
to just wondering about his, like, moral character. So it was just so fun the way that this film played with my expectations and how I viewed this character over time.
Wow. I am so fascinated by that because I didn't think about if he was good at all or not. I just assumed he was not, which maybe says more about me than anything else, but that is fascinating. This whole film would be so different if he was genuinely good. I think that's the version of this film that we often will get in other, far more earnest tellings, which is the person that is genuinely very talented and also willing to go after their dreams, and they toe closer to the line of, like, doing what they need to get their big break, but they don't go past the line. But we root for those characters so much that are genuinely so talented, and we too are like, "We just want this moment for you." And, yeah, I'm fascinated that was a journey that you went on kinda in the first half of this film.
Yeah, it kept me on my toes for sure.
Mhm.
But I think the more that he was emphatic about not doing his bit in front of a live audience, the more that I was like, "Oh, no, you can't be good." Like, especially if you're in New York, like, okay, you know, that is a harsh audience, and they're gonna let you know if your stand-up is not good. So I need you to go in front of that audience and hone your craft and test your chops. But him being unwilling to do that, I was like, "Oh, no, this is gonna be bad."
What's also fascinating, along that same vein, is when he does finally do a portion of his bit, it's not like he's absolutely terrible, which I also think is, like, pretty interesting.
Mhm.
He's just mediocre, and it feels a little bit, like, done already, and the points are not super punchy, but they're not total flops. Like, he doesn't get up there and just absolutely tank. I think that the movie kind of implies that the audience, receives him, like, warmly enough. Like, it's not utter awkward silence. And so that is a fascinating detail as well, and I think changes also the way that you would read this movie if he genuinely was absolutely horrible, um, and just completely tanks. But the fact that he's somewhat okay, but not by any means stellar, is also an interesting perspective on just, like, again, there could be potential with him had he put in the effort to hone his
Mm,
craft
mhm.
and land the timing and really get better. He could be really good. It's not a total dud, and um that feels like such an intentional choice too, which I thought was, now that I think about it, really interesting that he's not absolutely horrible. Like, he's delusional enough to believe that he's incredible, but he's not absolutely delusional where he is genuinely terrible and believes he's incredible. There is something there.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that that also speaks to the tragedy of this character too. He could have had a future in this industry had he done the right thing, and he was given opportunities, he just didn't see them. And so then he chooses violence, and he chooses infamy instead. And I think that that leads to a little bit of the tragedy of this
Mm,
character, which is
yeah.
funny in a movie called The King of Comedy. So that's also just fun.
Yes. Very philosophical around what they say around like the line between comedy and tragedy is also like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious your thoughts about Masha as a character and the ways that Rupert and her kind of intersect and bump against each other and then collaborate together by the end. Um, curious your thoughts in your reading on that.
Okay, can we just say that Sandra Bernhard does a fantastic job in this movie, in that character. At the end, when it's just her and Jerry,
Oh,
and she's just saying every word known to man, that was phenomenal. She was captivating. Like,
yeah.
holy crap, she's so good in this. Um, I I am a fan. Like, yeah, Masha, you do what you want to do, girl. You live your life. I have so many questions about her because she lives in this like fancy town home. She has money, and yet she is obsessed with this man. Like, I have so many questions about who she is as a person, but that is not the point of this movie, and that is fine. Uh, but I think she added so much fun color to this, and even the evolution of her character, because we first meet her when she's just this crazy fan that won't get out of his car. Like, that is a bonkers place for a character to start. And over time, she
It just
seems
gets better. Yeah.
right. she she has these like antagonistic moments, these really obsessive moments, and you're just like, oh honey, let's just get you into some therapy, let's get you just in a different place. You can be better than this. But then at the end there, you get some insight into more of who she is, and I just love this kind of weird journey that we go on with her as a character. Uh, I loved it. I thought she was great. I am a fan.
I feel like she's such an interesting tonal choice to include in this film, and the banter and the sparring back and forth between Rupert and her at the beginning, I think make for some really like great moments. But also, you realize by the end when they team up together, like they have a lot of the same unhinged energy about them that is coursing through them the same way, which is simultaneously why they like butt heads so much at the beginning, but they are one and the same in a lot of ways. Um, and I think in some ways, Masha is the more unrestrained version of what we know is brewing inside Rupert. Um, it's different in nature, like their intentions are different, of course. Like Rupert's less like excited about the idea of these like intimate moments and connection with Jerry and more about his career, but they have a lot of the same willingness to just tunnel vision go after what they want and are willing to go the extra mile beyond what is quote unquote normal and ethical and all that kind of stuff to get there. And so that same like again tenacity, persistence, like go getter attitude, like they both have that in extreme ways. And we see when those two are aligned now by the end, they just fuel each other even further. Um, but I think that uh, Masha has made that I think a lot more she just suppressed it less than I think that Rupert at the beginning is like trying to reel it in, and you see a lot of that frenetic energy in him and in his interactions, his eyes, the way that he operates in the world, and by the end, he too has fully let that go unrestrained by the end as well.
Well, and I love that Rupert does all of this so that he can be famous. Uh, Masha does all of this so that she can knit him a sweater. like, and go on a date with him. And I just think that that's so funny. Uh that their actions are so similar, but their intended outcomes are so different. And I think that that makes it even more interesting. Even their interactions after they've kidnapped Jerry, and Rupert goes through the whole thing with the cue cards. He gets his
That
his
is one of my favorite scenes.
Oh my gosh, it's so funny. When Jerry says, "It's not grammatically correct, but I think you have the idea," after all of those cue cards, that was so funny to me. I'm like, "You're being held hostage, you have a gun pointed at your head, and you don't give a crap, and you're just going to call these yahoos out for their incompetence in their kidnapping." Ugh, it
Yeah.
was perfect. But I love that we go from all of that to him in that sweater that she made for him.
Yes.
It's just it was so
Like, taped
funny.
up.
Yes. It was so good. So it's just those little moments that I loved about this movie. It's so funny in such a dark way. And it's
Uh-huh.
like it's tragically funny. And I think that Rupert and Masha really demonstrate that so well.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's what makes this movie, uh, uh, maybe difficult to market is the way to describe it, and we've talked about this before around genre and expectations and whatnot, but when you go to a movie called The King of Comedy, like, this is not the movie that you
Yeah.
expect, but it is funny. You know, the little toy gun bit, him dropping the cue cards. There's so many little jabs between, um, Masha and Rupert. So many of the scenes of Rupert just, like, in the waiting room are, like, pretty hilarious, but you're kind of like, "I'm laughing, but I'm also like, 'Oh my.'" Like, this is
Mhm.
uncomfortable because these people, you can tell, are unhinged and are capable of much they have not shown you yet, and they are being, endearingly hilarious, but it is there, but brimming beneath the surface, and that is unsettling. So I this is a impossible film to market.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I probably even harder back in the '80s when I feel like
Yeah.
things were much more limited in genre.
Yep.
Obviously, there was genre bending, uh, but I feel like now we're a lot more fluid with our genres, even though I still think that our genre system isn't great. I feel like it might be easier to market something like that today than it was back then, especially because 'cause we've had so many black comedies in recent years, but yeah. I mean, I guess that explains why it was a box office flop, but that still makes me a little bit sad. Like, this
But
would have
you
been
I think
great
also
to see in theaters, like
yes, this would have been incredible to see in theaters. But I
right?
think that you mentioned something earlier, which I think is pretty fascinating about this, which is that I think sometimes Black comedies tend to be, more colorful in its emotion and its catharsis, like, and this movie feels incredibly, um, uh, understated in a lot of ways in that we also don't get the emotional catharsis in the end. Like, if you really look at
Mm,
it, like you mentioned,
mhm.
not a lot happens. Like, the middle section, we'll go back to this was a point that I was making earlier. The middle section, nearly very little happens tactically from a plot perspective other than, like, Rupert continually going again and again in different episodes in vignettes in the waiting room, waiting for his moment. Some little conversations, things happen, but, like, nothing big, substantial, m meaty from a plot perspective really happens, and even by the end, there's the whole kidnapping, which is great, but it's not that tension and release that I think is inherently, like, satisfying about a big plot-driven film where something happens and we have to react to it. Not a lot happens in this movie, and yet it feels like we've gone so far on an emotional journey with these characters, and I think that is an interesting tension that is also part of this movie, and also why maybe from a box office perspective, it was more challenging. Like this is unique in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. It's not the big explosive ending. It's not the emotional catharsis every step of the way of sometimes like the way that black comedies and comedies in general are big and over the top and can still be dark.
No, that's really good because it's all about the character, which it is kind of fascinating that this is largely like a character study. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, because I mean that is the whole point is getting inside of Rupert's mind and understanding. I don't even feel like you understand him fully by the end, but understanding more of who he is and what has driven him to such extreme behaviors. And it's not until the very end when the kidnapping happens that you see, action happen. You get him being persistent, you get him showing up at Jerry's house, these little moments of aggression, but it's not until the end that we actually see the fulfillment of his ethos. But that's only satisfying because we have spent an hour plus with this guy getting inside of his mind.
Mhm.
Yeah. And also like what a follow-up to Raging Bull. This came out
Oh
2
my
years
god.
after Raging Bull, so I wonder if that's also part of it. Like Scorsese has this giant hit, Raging Bull, which is a totally different movie. Uh, and then to follow it up with The King of Comedy, I think is also a pretty interesting choice.
Yes, and they are so different in its volume of emotional catharsis as well. Like
Yeah.
we are on every extreme emotion through the journey of Raging Bull. It is so kinetic, it is so visceral. That's the thing. Like nothing about King of Comedy is visceral. It's incredibly understated, nuanced, cerebral, subtle, character driven, but like I can imagine that if you have seen previous films of Scorsese's that have that same like visceral, raw, unhinged, kinetic energy, and you go in expecting that in King of Comedy, like this is not it. This is actually very restrained, and I think that's the power of this film is that it is incredibly restrained, and there's so much burning beneath the surface that we feel, but we can't express, and it's never actually like bubbled over in its fullness over the course of the film. And I think that's what makes this film so captivating, but also probably misunderstood as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we need justice for the King of Comedy. We need more people to
Yes,
give this movie a chance.
we do. I mean, the we really, I feel like, get in King of Comedy a small sliver of Rupert Pumpkin's like larger trajectory, and I think the film really implies that like he is on a far longer trajectory, and there's so much more that he's capable of. We just have seen this little slice of it. Like this is just the surface of all that is brewing within Rupert Pumpkin. That's my read on it. And so I feel like with, say, Raging Bull, with Goodfellas, all that, we see that character like fully unleash everything that is in them, good, bad, ugly, everything. And then we see them reckon with it and either find redemption or don't or whatever it is, but like it all the gunk comes out. In this one, we get a little squeeze of the gunk that comes out of Rupert, and as a character study, that's like kind of an interesting choice too. That we get the sliver.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it really does feel like you just scratched the surface of this character, which is
Mm-hmm.
wild because there's so much that happens over the course
Yeah.
of an hour 48 or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and yet there are depths to this character that we'll never explore.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
Wild.
Okay. Any other thoughts about King of Comedy? That things that stood out to you, noteworthy?
Yeah, I one of the things that I found really interesting was uh Rupert's misogyny kind of brewing below the surface. I don't know if
Mm,
you picked up on this, but it was so interesting to watch his interactions with women contrasted with his interactions with men, even when the women were in, like, a position of authority. So, when he's in the reception area and just will not leave, you know, the receptionist asks him to leave and he refuses, but when the security guard comes, who is a male security guard,
mm,
he will leave.
interesting.
And so you just see these little things all throughout, even his interactions with Kathy,
With
and she is a woman
yeah.
in a position of power, and he does not respect that and will not listen to her. And so I just found it so interesting all throughout this film. His interactions with women were fascinating to me, and how he just kind of, and it's all below the surface because he is very polite, but you can just tell this, for lack of a better term, like aggression and unwillingness to listen to what a woman has to say because he wants something and they are a hindrance to what he wants. I don't know
Mm,
if you picked up on any of that, but like the whole time I was just going, "Oh no, this is bad for every woman in this movie."
mm. Yeah, interesting. No, I wasn't as privy to that bit, but I think that it's those, like, underlying, um, like, nuances in where he chooses to, like, unleash little bits of that aggression too that I think is pretty fascinating because he's doing it with a smile, he's doing it with the charisma, like, he is walking that fine line of being like, so close to getting kicked out of the waiting room again and again and again, but there's, like, a bumbling good-naturedness about him that I think is also, like, a little bit, confusing for some of the characters as well, that potentially, contributes to those, like, interactions feeling like, "Oh, okay, like, he's just very persistent." Is he very persistent, or is, like, this man is, like, "We need to get him out," and Um, I'm curious about if you felt that way in his interactions with Rita as well. I feel like that's a character that gets a lot of screen time. You know, there aren't very many characters, honestly, in this entire movie, but she gets quite a bit of screen time. I think his like childlike way of interacting with her is kind of fascinating to me. But I'm curious your thoughts on the topic of his interactions with women, the way that he relates with Rita.
Yeah, the whole time I was going like, "Girl, I need you to run." Like, "What are you doing?" Cuz like, okay, yeah, he's at the bar. Okay, I knew this guy 15 years ago in high school. I'll give him a chance. I'll go out to dinner with him. And I was like, "Okay, like that feels like an appropriate thing to do." But everything else, I was like, "Ma'am, what are you doing? This is not a safe situation for you to be in." Um because she like he goes with her to her apartment. And I'm like, "Why would you let this man know where you live?" And then she kind of like half-heartedly invites him in, and I was like, "What are you doing? This is not safe. You do not invite the crazy person into your apartment." So I was concerned for Rita for the whole movie. And I wanted her to have uh some better friends who could maybe talk through some of these things with her and go, "Okay, you are a single woman who is living in New York City, and I just need you to be a little bit more careful about your dating choices just to make sure that you stay safe and alive." um so yeah, that's really what I wanted for her, was that stronger support system to help her with her boyfriend choices.
So she needs to go grab some dinner with Catwoman from Matt Reeves' live action Batman.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that'd be
Yeah,
great.
they could have some things that it could be the blind leading the blind, but some things to
Hey,
bond over.
exactly. You know, sometimes you need a sounding board to bounce these things off of, and
Yes.
sometimes it's hard to see the red flags when you're the person in the situation, though she seemed to see the red flags.
Right.
And so sometimes you just need a friend to help you out and say, hey, there's some red flags. You shouldn't be doing this. You should get out of this relationship.
Mhm.
I
Yep.
want that for her.
But nope. She she stays. She
Yep,
stays. She watches him
sure
on the
does.
TV with his
Yep.
big break. Oh, Rita. Yeah.
Yeah.
Red flag should have been, hey, we have showed up at Jerry Langford's house and he did not know we were here.
Hello.
And she's like, oh, he wasn't expecting you? Um, hello? The alarm bell should be sounding, lady.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that at the end of that interaction, like it takes her too long to get to the conclusion that she gets to, but she does get there, and so I really respected that. But even how she was like, "I'm so sorry, I didn't realize what was going on. We're getting out of here, Rupert. We're leaving right now." Like I appreciated that. Once she understood what was happening, she got the hell out as quickly as humanly possible. Um, and then I saw it as like a long period of time passed and those two don't have contact anymore. And so like Rupert shows up at her place of employment. She doesn't seek out him anymore. So I in my brain, my canon that I have created is that she just cut
Again.
him off completely and didn't have any more contact with him.
Oh.
Uh because that makes me feel a little bit better about Rita. Uh,
Okay.
because she makes some questionable
I support
choices,
this kid.
but I would
She
like to think that
does.
she learned from the Jerry's house incident.
That should be all you need to know, woman.
Yes.
You know?
Right? So, I like to
Yeah.
think that she learned the lesson.
But never underestimate the Rupert Pumpkin charisma.
I mean, I don't get it, but
It is
I'm sure it works
abundant.
for some people.
It is abundant. Yes.
Yes.
He's also unhinged, but the charisma is there. He knows how to work his angles.
Mhm. And work them he does. He
Oh, yes.
yes, he is nothing if not persistent and he will wear you down.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Anything else before we wrap up?
Okay, Jen, we got to talk about some pinky rings.
Oh my goodness. You're joking.
I'm not joking.
Where?
Jen,
Who?
seriously?
No.
Oh my gosh, I was so certain that you would get one of them. I am shocked because one is so prominent throughout the entire film. Oh, that's so
Really?
interesting.
Which
Yes.
one?
What is wrong with my brain that I hyperfixate on these things? Okay.
Or what am I fixating on that I'm
You
missing
know,
these?
you are watching the movie as humans do. And I hyperfixate on stupid things that don't matter, like pinky rings.
I want to hear. Who could it be?
Okay, so I
Does Rupert
counted.
have one?
Okay, so that's the most interesting. I counted 4 pinky rings in this movie
Oh my gosh. On different, 4 different humans?
on 4 different humans.
Oh my goodness.
So 2 of them are on
Landmine out
women.
here. Huh?
Well, 2 of them are women. The
Okay.
receptionist and Kathy both have like very tiny pinky rings on. So
Oh my goodness.
those can be discarded. They don't really like follow the pattern. Uh Jerry has a big old pinky ring on that he wears for the entire film. And that was the one that I was like, oh, I think Jen maybe spotted this one. Um,
No.
it's very large, right in your face.
Okay.
And so I feel like that for me tracks because I don't see Jerry as a good guy. Like, he's not
No, he's
a
not.
villain, but like, I don't know.
He's not great.
He's
There's a
not great.
hardness to him as a character. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, okay, so the most interesting pinky ring situation in this film is Rupert. Uh, in the beginning, in his first fantasy, I think it's his first one, where him and Jerry are sitting at a table and Jerry is trying to get Rupert to take over his show. Rupert is wearing a pinky ring
Mhm.
in that fantasy, but nowhere else in the film. And I think that that is fascinating.
Oh. Well, yeah, because I think ultimately like, Rupert fits the thesis
Mhm.
because, like, he may be good intentioned, but, does terrible things, therefore, we can categorize him into, um, the slew of other not so great men who wear rings, pinky rings, and what that says about them. So, I feel like that tracks, but specifically that it's that moment that he is wearing one compared to every other moment is pretty fascinating. Like, it's not in his kidnapping scenes, but it is, like, his fully realized fantasy of what he wants to be, which
Mhm.
is what are all the things that he needed to get there to get to that point where he's being
Yeah.
introduced. We could play that out, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, so I found that very, very interesting that in his fantasy, when he's made it and he's at the same level as Jerry, achieved that fame and that clout, that is the scene where he's wearing a pinky ring. I
Yes.
don't know.
Yes.
I found that really, really fascinating.
Well, especially when you put it in conversation with the fact that Jerry wears the pinky ring.
Mhm. Yep.
So, this is his way of being like
Yes.
his idol.
Yep. And maybe
Hmm.
that's what, Rupert was missing all along. Maybe if he in real life had slipped on a pinky ring, then all of the comedic doors would be open to him. Maybe that's what he was missing.
It's like the equivalent of Cinderella's glass slipper.
Yeah. You just
All
need
he needs is a
Jerry's
little
pinky
little
ring.
magical item. All right. Well, we've got some new data points. This is fabulous.
Yeah, yeah, we sure
Look
do.
at that.
I did not expect data points to come from this movie, but
No.
always happy to collect more data when it comes up.
Good job. We'll put them in our basket as we
Yeah.
truck along.
Indeed. That is exactly what we're doing.
Yes. Yes. Well, this is our review and discussion of King of Comedy. You can find it available on Paramount Plus with the Showtime edition. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us. Our name sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we can connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories. Everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you hung out with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you tune into your favorite shows. Drop us a review letting us know your thoughts about King of Comedy. You can connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at moviesandUsPod or email us at moviesandUsPod@gmail.com. We will be back next week continuing Scorsese September with his film Casino. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll see you next week.